excited to start the event and introduce our panelists tonight. So just to kick off the event, I'd love for our panelists, we've got Donna Lawler, we've got Anntonette Dailey and Sakuni Ranwala as our panelists. And what we'd love to do would be to have you guys say us a brief introduction about what you've studied and what position you have and what you love about your job, just to kick off the program, the event. And let's start with Donna.
Okay, since I'm off mute. My name's Donna Lawler and I am a principal at Azimuth Advisory, which is a law firm specialising in helping governments and companies with their space activities. So I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for a number of decades. I won't say exactly how long. But what I absolutely love about my job is just being involved in space missions. So we have a number of clients which throughout the evening I'll talk a little bit to the extent that I'm able to about some of the very cool things they're doing, and being a little part of that, even though I'm a lawyer, not an engineer, is a lot of fun.
Thank you, that was amazing. Would like to move on to Sakuni, if you could let us know.
I studied Bachelor of Robotics and Mechatronics, and I'm currently a systems engineer at Thales Australia. I'm currently working for the armed reconnaissance helicopter simulators, known as the Tiger helicopters. What excites me every day is I have a different challenge every day at work. I get to work with these different simulators. I get to go to different areas and learn something new every day and solve problems. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you. That's amazing. That sounds really exciting. I want to move on to Anntonette, or Annie, sorry about that. Annie next.
Not at all. So my name is Anntonette, or Annie Dailey. Today I'm actually acting as the Deputy Head for the Australian Space Agency, but nominally I'm actually one of the Executive Directors that looks after the operations and the communications for the agency. I did my undergraduate Bachelor of Engineering at UTS, and actually last year I got the Young Alumni of the Year award, which is usually a sign that you can be a deputy head of an agency as a Gen Y in my case. And my normal day-to-day role does involve a lot about the governance, the operations. Today I'm looking at developing and implementing in this Discovery Centre to inspire future generations to take on STEM. And so one part of my role is also to make sure I talk to as many students as possible to encourage them into a career that can look at space, because we're seeing that space is a very big opportunity in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you. And next, what we'll do with the program would be, we're just going to take turns asking questions for all of our panelists. So Shivangi will start with the first set of questions. Start off.
Definitely, congratulations, Annie, on that award. That's definitely amazing. We actually really want to know, how did you join the government and policy sector as someone who did study engineering and perhaps didn't have a background in policy or law?
So the wonderful part of the UTS engineering degree was that I was required to do 2 6-month internships. And I actually started my internships down the road from the UTS building in McKell Street, which is where the state government's public works area is. And I actually did my first internship when I was a first-year uni student. In a government public works area, which kind of does hands-on as well as policy as well. And once you're in government, it's much, much easier to move around to actually get to see where your skills are best suited. But I took that on, and from my first year at uni, I started working in the government sector. And by the time I finished my degree, I had 5 years of working in the government space, which set me up perfectly for a career.
I think that really shows the importance of internships and degrees, especially
absolutely,
which you can apply to so many various things as well. Donna, I have a question for you. Sorry if you can't hear me as well. I know we're having some issues with our.
Yeah, no, I can hear you fine now. It's good.
So how did you become a space lawyer when we didn't have a space agency within Australia until a couple of years ago? what was something, you know, what were you working on before?
Yeah. Well, it was a little bit by accident. So I was originally an intellectual property and technology lawyer. I studied law at Uni of New South Wales, and I was working for Minter Ellison in Sydney, and then Baker and McKenzie in Hong Kong. And then I after quite a bit of time overseas, I came back to Australia and found myself at Optus as a telco technology lawyer. Back then, the sexiest thing to be in was multimedia. Everybody was very excited about multimedia in 1998. And everybody was vying over that. And I got left, as the new girl, I got left with the thing that no one wanted to do, which was Optus satellite. So space wasn't cool back then. so that I spent 20 years then helping Optus Satellite build a fleet of, well, they weren't physically building them themselves, but purchase and launch a number of very large geostationary satellites. So I worked on a number of those missions, advising them about what happens when you move things around in space, and buying and selling various kinds of satellite services. And I had to learn the whole space law part as I went along, which was meant on my very first day, I was met by this bald rocket scientist with the white doingy hair. He said, "I'm the Optus scientist." That was Dr. Gordon Pike. He said, if you're going to be helping Optus Satellite, you need to read these. And he thrust into my hand what was then called the Space Activities Act, which attached all of the international space treaties, like the Outer Space Treaty, all the way through to the Moon Agreement. And my head was spinning. I thought, what on earth? So I had to sit down and read through all those, and then was promptly thrown into a civilian and military space program, which that was 20 years ago, and the rest is history. 2 years ago, I left Optus and started my own law firm because it became clear there was enough activity in the private sector to need a private lawyer with experience. So I've been doing space law for 20 years, one way or another.
It's incredible. You have a job now, even if it wasn't cool back then. It's cool now, definitely.
I love how it started by mistake.
Yeah.
Got like one of the most coolest jobs.
There's lots of cool jobs in space.
It's something that I think we all kind of remember from our childhood in space and how much we love it, but we kind of lose that a little bit, unfortunately. I was promoting even doing, more STEM work in high school and things like that, and it's really important. Well, I know, Sakuni, you're actually a recent graduate from what I looked on your LinkedIn. How did you join Aeronautics, and how did you join TALIS, and being such a 2016 graduate?
Yep. So I graduated in 2017, and I think when I was close to graduating, I was like, this is what I want to do. It's been what I want to do, since I can remember. Space, aircraft, was my thing, and I wanted to know how they all work, and hence why I sort of did engineering, and I was really hoping that I would land a job in the field. So I went to a lot of exhibitions, a lot of conferences, did a lot of networking. And I was at Avalon 3 years, consecutive 3 years at Avalon. Volunteered there because I just love being around aircraft. So I was there for 7 days straight. It was a good experience. So I networked there a lot, and I met a lot of people from TALIS. And then I mentioned to them that I did apply for their graduate program. Met with a couple of people, one of the technical directors and one person from HR. They're like, why don't you send me your resume straight to my email? I'm like, yes, of course. And they were like, do you mind if it's in Sydney? Because I'm originally from Melbourne. I'm like, no, of course not. If I get this job, I will move to Sydney. It's fine. Then I emailed them. I got an interview, and then I landed in TALIS. It's been great ever since.
That's the dream. Just be able to send your resume through to someone and them to, get your job, and you to be able to move states.
Every graduate's dream.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's about I think it's about, you know, when you're a young graduate, it's about taking that risk and, you know, doing, if that's what you want to do, just taking a leap of faith. And yeah, I'm loving it.
That's amazing. I'll take some notes. When I, now, what I want to ask would be, I want to ask Anntonette a question. So I really want to ask you, like, how is it like, I know that we touched a bit on, like, you know, your job when you did introduce yourself, but I wanted to ask you, like, what is it like having the coolest job as the executive director of Australian Space Agency, and what do you do day to day in your role?
All right. I have to say it is one of the coolest jobs. We're a very small agency, about 40 people. So it does mean that part of the leadership team is that you get to see a lot of what's happening across the agency. If I just look at today, for example, today I am doing a deputy head role, so it's a little bit more than I would normally do. But, you know, this morning, you know, it starts very quickly with parliamentarians asking, you know, very, very rightly, what are we doing? What are our updates on certain activities? Because obviously they're very interested about what we're doing and making sure that we get the benefit for the public. Then second up was Royal Commission into the state of the bushfires. I think everybody here remembers before COVID that we had some of the most devastating bushfires, and how the agency can respond to those bushfire scenarios to try to combat their devastation in the future. And we produced a bushfire task force at the request of our minister. And so we spent a little time this morning trying to respond to all the activities of the Royal Commission into the bushfires, to say what we can do. Because, you know, the thing about space is that it's not just up there. You know, a lot of people think it's, you know, a dream-worthy explorer's job and, you know, what astronauts do. But the real business side of it and the real humanitarian side of it is that we use space to look back at Earth for most of our activities. And amazing if we could see a future where space can actually help save lives through the access to real-time data. And happy to let anybody know about some of the works we're doing in that area. Today we also had a webinar that the agency did for funding. We've got a program called Going to the Moon and Going on to Mars, and we have 150 million towards that activity. And today we did a webinar to inform the public about what some of the funding is going to be used for, how we can use that, and a little bit about how to apply, because we've got grants that are open right now for people to apply for projects. And those are all our engagement activities. Then today is also, as well, you know, you're trying to just cram a lot into a day. I spent a lot of time this afternoon talking about the Space Discovery Centre. We've got, here's an announcement. You don't often hear announcements occurring before the politicians, but we're working really hard to announce some of our works to inspire a nation to consider space and to see the value of space. And I spent a bit of time, because I am based in South Australia, talking locally to make sure we're ready for that announcement and that launch when that does occur. And then I've done 2 presentations today to another group of students and then yourselves tonight. And that's an ordinary day in between, you know, more routine administrative items that I won't bore you with. But it is cool because it's a job that has real benefits for individuals. Our purpose very much squarely says that space will improve the lives of Australians. So whilst we might have the stars in our eyes, we also really realise that this is an economic opportunity, and there's real business outcomes. So if you've got a passionate spark for entrepreneurial activities, even UTS's Entrepreneur Hub that actually does a lot of work on space too, they reach out to us. And there's just so much excitement for it. So hence why I do have one of the coolest jobs. And interestingly, I've always been interested in space, even at high school. I think I went to every space camp, and then at uni, I went to every single space conference, because you can usually put up your hand and volunteer and get free access. And that's what I did at UTS for my first 5 years. I went to every single space conference that I could attend as a volunteer, so I didn't have to pay. But I got to learn and got to connect. And I do remember Gordon Pike that Donna was talking about. And you get to know these people, and then they help you further on in your career.
That sounds amazing, and that sounds like a really, really busy day. You definitely deserve a break after this. And one of the things that you said, like all these things that the space agency is doing, it's like encouraging like people like us and like anyone else who has like entrepreneur ideas to start up, have a business, which is really great and encouraging. And this would potentially help the space like industry grow here in Australia. And this does give me a perfect segue to my next question to Donna, which is like, what skills should like lawyers build up if they want to work in the space industry, or like, are there any legal aspects to keep in mind when starting to work, let's say to make a space mission, or maybe like a startup?
Yeah, well, I think if you are a lawyer, I don't know, I wish I could ask you for a hands up, all the students who are watching, but nobody's got their camera on, so I can't see. But I don't know if we've got any lawyers in the audience there. But for lawyers, I would say there are a number of aspects that you can get into in space. For my particular path, it was learning about intellectual property law, technology law, and becoming a commercial lawyer. So my particular path was learning about contracts, in particular technology contracts, and then learning about the special slant that technology contracts have when they've got a space aspect. And what I've found is that space contracts actually deal with risks very differently from the way that risks are dealt with in the terrestrial area. And one big way that they're very different is that the risks are managed more on the basis of when they happen, so the timing, rather than whose fault it is. So there's more focus on passing a risk from one party to another based on a nice, clear time frame, rather than whose fault was it, and then a whole lot of finger pointing. That's in very broad general terms during a launch. In terms of, I suppose I'd add to that, I think in the future there's going to be opportunities for all kinds of different lawyers in space. So I happen to be a commercial lawyer. Clearly, if you look at what Annie's doing, and Annie happens to be an engineer, but there are other people in the space agency who have a legal background and have gone into the policy and regulatory area. So having background in government and policy and regulations, that's another area. One of the aspects of our work at Azimuth Advisory is we help a number of governments with drafting their different space laws. So we've helped, I think, 9 governments now develop regulations and so on. The other branch of your question about what do you need to keep in mind if you're preparing a space mission, and this is now where I'm aiming this more at the people who are starting startups and engineers who might end up working in either established or startup space businesses. One of the key things is that one of the key legal frameworks that you need to keep in mind is that space is an area beyond national jurisdiction. So if you fly a plane through the air, if you're doing that over Australia, you're in Australian jurisdiction, you're in Australian airspace. But if you go over a certain point, and under Australian law, that point is 100 kilometres above mean sea level, then you're in an area beyond Australia's jurisdiction. But because you can have an impact in this international jurisdictional area, you can have an impact on other space users and on other nations on your way up there. You need to get a license from the space agency. So one of the very early things you need to do when you're designing your mission is, what do we need to incorporate in this design to make sure that not only am I not only is it going to work, not only is it going to make me money, hopefully, but am I going to be a good space citizen? Is this going to be the kind of mission that the Australian Space Agency, if I'm an Australian company, is going to want to give a license to for the launch, either launch from Australia or launch overseas? And one of the very, very early things you need to keep in mind is, are we complying with international debris mitigation guidelines? Because the Space Agency is going to look very closely at that. And one of the rules is going to be that you need to comply with an international space debris mitigation guideline. So don't put any little fiddly bits that might drop off along the way, because you may put in jeopardy your ability to get a license. And then just very quickly, the last thing I'd say is that don't sign anything, don't sign any contracts without talking to someone who is an actual space lawyer, because sometimes those, when you go to get a license, the space agency will also want to look at all of your launch contracts and relevant contracts to do with the mission. And if they don't have particular terms in there that protect the Australian taxpayer from liability, for example, they may be, your application for a permit or a license may be rejected. So look at the legal side very early.
That's when we'll have to come find you to help us.
Please do.
I also wanted to ask you, so you did mention like earlier about the risks and during the launch, like whose liabilities it's going to be. Is there like a set timing? Like, is it like a fraction of a second that determines whose risk, like who it falls, like whose liability it falls on? If anything were to go wrong, I just want to.
Well, it's determined by partly by contract, partly by national laws, and partly by international treaties. So the whole question of liability is complicated, but the most common thing in contracts is for and there's different kinds of risks that you look at. So there's the risk to your own spacecraft, there's the risk to the other spacecraft on the launch and the launch vehicle, there's a risk to the launch pad and everybody around the launch pad, and and then there's risk to third parties that might have nothing to do with your mission, but they might happen to be flying in a plane nearby, or they might have own a spacecraft that happens to be flying in your path. So all of those things are dealt with differently under international law, national law, and contract law. But generally what would happen is your launch provider would not take any responsibility for your spacecraft. So you have to ensure that yourself, so that it would be very normal for the launch provider to say, even if I've been negligent, don't come crying to me, get your own insurance for your spacecraft. If you happen to, let's just say then your spacecraft is the thing that blows up along the way up and causes damage to another spacecraft on the same launch, you would be protected from being sued by everybody else by what's called a cross waiver, an inter-party cross waiver of liability. And the idea behind that is no one's going to sue somebody else for saying you negligently built your satellite, or you negligently launched my satellite, or your rocket destroyed my satellite. Everybody agrees that they will insure their own satellite and they won't complain. And they'll also make sure that their bankers and customers and so on don't sue anybody else in the mission. So, but the timing of when these things, when the risk passes one to another is usually either at the moment of launch or the moment of intentional ignition. But there's a whole kind of matrix as to how it's managed. And then once you get into space, if you hit something, for example, another spacecraft, let's just say you hit one of the SpaceX-owned spacecraft from Starlink and you blew it up, well, that would be Annie's problem. So if you rent a car and crash it when you're on holidays in Italy, the Italian government's not going to ring up Annie or anyone else in the Commonwealth government. But if your spacecraft crashes into another spacecraft and there was some fault involved, that's where fault is relevant. It could be that in that case, the United States might be contacting the Australian Space Agency and saying, oh, we might need to make a claim under the Liability Convention. So international law says that Australia and all of the other launching states involved may well be liable for that. And that's Australia's national legislation then deals with, in a layered kind of a way, how that responsibility is divvied up.
Wow, that's so interesting. I think I got 3 takeaways. Read contracts. There are a lot of complicated things involved when sending stuff to space, and don't crash into SpaceX aircraft or anyone's aircraft.
I think that's a good start.
Guys, just 3 points, main points. And so just with this one, I also like, as we're going to like, I just want to go a bit more technical into like my next question to Sakuni, which would be regarding simulators. Like, it would be amazing if you could tell us how like the simulators that, like, let's say you're working on, how they work, and I'd also like to want to ask about the effectiveness of those simulators, let's say in the learning process, and how effective has it been proven as well in the past.
Yep, I'm going to try and screen share because I have a few photos that would help with that. Share screen.
Cool. That's it.
Can you guys see the 2 domes?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yep, awesome, cool. So these are full flight mission simulators. Simulators come in all different kinds of shapes and forms. This one is on motion. So simulator might have like a motion system. So the legs would move, the simulator would move to give you that realistic effect when you're actually flying around the aircraft or whatever the simulator might be. Simplest way to put it is it's like a game. We all love games. We all love playing games. The best thing about simulators is you get to learn how to fly these, and if you crash, you don't die or have any injuries. So apart from flying, most simulators, yes, pilots do learn to fly in these, but also there's other aspects to having simulators, like planning a mission and how they can execute the mission. How they can learn to operate the avionics suite of this aircraft. So some simulators are specific to which aircraft that they actually simulate, or they are in generic just to learn how to fly. So there's a facility that we have have like full flight simulators so pilots can learn to fly. Then we have what is called tactical trainers that they can plan a mission and execute it, learn how to use sonars, radars, that sort of stuff as well. And then we have simulators for marshalists to learn how to direct aircrafts and to learn all the signals. So when you put the right signal, the aircraft would move and simulate if you're doing the right action to make that aircraft land in the correct spot. We have a virtual reality trainer with VR headsets to train rescue missions, so helicopter rescue missions. So we do that as well. Definitely help in the learning aspect of it. So I'll just go to the next photo. So that's an inside of a simulator. So it's replicated just like the actual aircraft itself. You get inside the dome, you close the doors, and you're immersed in the experience. Next one's a different kind of simulator. Again, same sort of concept. Learning, yes, it improves learning by a lot, because by the time they actually go into the real world, they are familiar with the controls. They're familiar with what the instruments are going to do. They're familiar with the feel of it. So everything that's made in a simulator, so there's classes of simulators. The class D simulator is supposed to be the very similar to the real aircraft. So every button feel would be the same feel as the aircraft. So these are things that we need to test, and we have to actually get the approval that yes, they actually do replicate the same feel, same weight of things in the aircraft. And all these things matter because when you're doing mission critical stuff, you need to be able to act on muscle memory, and that's what we work on. We make sure that when it's the same distance as the simulator as the aircraft, so when they reach for a button, it's actually there, and it's not the muscle memory is important there. It adds a big advantage, because if you are to fly a real aircraft, it's really costly to be doing so much training for so many different pilots or mission controllers to be able to go through that training and be able to give that amount of training to everybody. So simulators help you do most of the training on ground. And when you go out there, you know what you're doing, you can fly an aircraft, you're more comfortable. Yeah, so we do things like, so some areas very in detail on the database. So when you fly through the area, it looks like the real world. An example of something would be when Navy has a new ship, they have different procedures, and different lights mean different things on approach to the runway. So we would simulate that ship. So when the simulator is trying to land on it, it will simulate all these different signs or lights that will indicate different things. So when they are actually approaching the real ship, now the pilots know what that means. Pilots know where to go, what to do. So yeah, it adds a lot of pre-learning before they actually go out on field to do their jobs. So yeah, I do have a couple of videos which I will post on the chat if you guys are interested to go have a look at those as well.
Yes, of course. Thank you. That was really interesting. I have a little bit of technical question, maybe a bit of a tailing question of what you did mention about simulators. So as you did mention, you did explain to us about how simulators work and the different kinds of them. I wanted to ask you, like, you know, how these like data collected, so the simulator data to mimic the real world, is it like the flights, when they take off the flight, all these data, like you guys have taken the data and then simulate, like modeled it in a certain way?
Yes, so because our customers being the Commonwealth, so they will provide us the data that they need, these specific areas with high detail, and these specific areas they just don't really care. So for the areas that's like, you know, forest or whatever, so we put like a similar one terrain for there, but then if they want detail, then they provide us the data to replicate the exact buildings, the roads and everything. Same with the aircraft data as well. So the aircraft, whoever the manufacturer is, like they will provide us the data that we need to make the flight model, to make the simulator behave the same way as the aircraft. Sometimes the software can be from different companies, then they only send us the executable, which then integrates into our software. And then whatever our side of the software does then needs to talk to each other and be able to communicate and work together. So, yeah.
Thank you. That does explain a lot as to how real the simulators are, and that's amazing that we've got so many training tools to make everything safer for people who are learning. And the next part, like we're heading to the second part of the questions, so I'll give it over to Shvangi.
I mean, I wouldn't mind trying simulators myself. Yeah. So I wouldn't mind doing that. I had a question for Annie, going back to what you said previously about all the uses for space technology, and one of them being obviously to help with the bushfires, and hopefully, I know probably a bad season is going to come up again soon in a few months, and it's already getting a bit warmer. What are some of the uses of space technology that not just the Australian Space Agency, but you're finding entrepreneurs and people maybe even in high schools are interested in looking at?
Well, this is actually a wonderful time, actually, if you are interested in joining the space industry, is that we've got a very big audacious goal to create an extra 20,000 jobs over the next 9 years. That is very big, particularly in the COVID times, but we're working really hard to drive the economy so that it's actually a business imperative, not just, you know, government handout on these kind of components. We see that there's a real business opportunity to be involved in space. And the interesting thing is, you know, when you ask students, you know, younger kids, what do they want to do? And lots of them say astronauts. And the reality is that so many of the jobs are much more diverse, and you can do them. Like they're not a tiny percentage of the population. So obviously you've got, I'm just going to run through the very variety of career opportunities, so that even if, you know, like me, I wasn't super duper good at the technical stuff. I am an engineer, but it wasn't my strengths. But I used the capabilities I learned in a policy setting. But you've got the engineering, you've got the technical experts, you've got the systems engineering. You know, there's a lot of business development that engineers are very good at doing. Program managers. I mean, we run major programs here, whether you're doing a technical one or a government program, that's program management skills and capabilities. And then of course, design and craft, coding. Then you have the field of scientists. So if you're much more on the scientific side of things, you know, that's developing your payloads, all the exciting satellite components. Investigators, data analysis is just going to be phenomenally huge. It's not to say that the previous bachelor was an astrophysicist, but that's a very good career path for people that are working in data mining and data capabilities. But the commerce side, Donna's very right that the space law side of things is absolutely exploding, and space lawyers also need people that can do the link between the engineering and the lawyers, who can transfer that kind of information. But we're looking down a path that Australia might have its first commercial launches, and that's a brand new field and area, and requires so much activity to occur to be able to make sure that they are safe. And you've got the whole designing careers, designing a spacecraft, structures, and designing structures for different environments. The spacesuits. We've got Australians here who are world leaders in the human life sciences associated with space. Then you've got the manufacturing technicians, and then the medical side, which is your telehealth is very much based on space applications. If you're going to be doing health management in remote areas like Antarctica, it is no different doing it in Antarctica as if you would be doing it in space. It's not like you can just turn around and have, a 5-minute trip back and get your teeth fixed or your hernia dealt with. That all has to be done remotely, and that requires medical professions. And then you've got the communication side, which is a little bit what I do as well, which is, explaining space and science in a way that really captures the public. Because at the end of the day, the space agency very much is a government. We're fully government funded. So we need to make sure that we explain to the public, to mums, dads, politicians, why we need to be investing in space. But yes, space does improve lives. My background was actually in disaster management prior to being in the agency, and from a policy setting. And it's very exciting to see that, the small role that space can do with space-based applications. And I'm more than happy to talk to people about what my hopes and dreams are. But one of the ones that I really hope that students will do for me is, we're using satellite technology we're going to augment satellite technologies to make it capable that on your phone, that little blue dot that says where you are, currently, can't tell which side of the road you are on sometimes. The technologies that we're working on right now will make that dot in any part of Australia, in your remote areas, in your maritime areas, down to an accuracy of 10 centimetres. And that's amazing, where in most cases you wouldn't get any GPS capability. And then down in your cities areas, down to 3 centimetres. And you can think about autonomous vehicles, you can think about how those can change lives. But I have a grandmother that really struggles. She's in Melbourne, she's all by herself, she can't get any help, and she can't cross the road to get her groceries because she's somewhat blind. But if she had a technology and an app that told her, you've got a step here, you've got a car coming, you've got a brake, she can actually go and get her groceries. She can look after herself much more ably, all based on somebody developing an app and capability. So that's the kind of things that, space can actually really help people in their everyday lives. And if somebody does come up with that app in the next few years' time, I will be your biggest fan.
Yeah, your grandma, and definitely me, people are geographically challenged. Directions anywhere. That would be definitely very helpful for. I have a question a bit outside of what you do, but I was listening to the Engineering Heroes podcast you were on, and you were listening to like the top 100 books, and I think you were maybe on like 6 or something you had left. You had like a handful of books left. I was wondering, have you finished the list, and which books did you perhaps find the most insightful and impactful to your life?
So I was reading the Dimick's Top 100 list, which includes things like The Hobbit, not for the faint-hearted, which is really, really hard to deal with elfish language. What? Books are an amazing way of being able to grasp a lot of exciting information. And to be honest, the recent one that I've read, which gave me a bit of a laugh, it's not for the faint-hearted too, is the first Astronaut Wives Club, which was the looking at the moon landings from the wives of the astronauts. It's a bit salacious, so a good bedtime reading story. It's got quite a bit of humour, but it's one that I read recently. It's not on the top 100 list, but it was quite interesting. And I would always recommend Hidden Figures, the book, over the movie. The movie was fabulous, but the book goes into more details.
Yeah, definitely, I'll put those two on my list, especially the salacious one. You probably won't be able to put that one. I should read before bed.
But Hidden Figures, it's on.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely putting that on my list now.
It's a great movie as well, like you said.
Yeah.
Flash actually had some really specific questions for Donna. She's really wanting to ask her.
Yes, I'm really keen to ask this next question. Like, I've been watching a lot of crime TV shows on Netflix, and it's probably going to be a bit of dramatic question.
Drum roll.
I want to ask you, like, if a crime is committed on International Space Station, like, which jurisdiction would apply? Like, let's say, like, if someone convicts like a murder or like, some really like heinous crimes, what would happen?
Yeah, well, recently someone did commit allegedly a crime on the International Space Station, and it did create a bit of a flurry of media attention about that very question. Remember, as I said earlier in this discussion, once you're in space, you're in an area beyond national jurisdiction. So, like if you're on the high seas, if you're in Antarctica, you're not necessarily, well, Antarctica may be a more complicated question, but you're not in Australia anymore. You're not in Kansas anymore, Dorothy. If you're on the International Space Station, though, there is an agreement between states that governs whose jurisdiction applies, and that covers some of the situations. So it's called the Intergovernmental Agreement, and they've specifically agreed that if a crime, for example, were to happen in let's just say the Russian module, that Russian law would apply in that case. But there are some overlapping things, because so Russian law applies in the Russian module, European law applies in the European Space Agency module, but of course I think there are, is it 9 or 11 countries involved in that? That's quite a lot. You've then got to figure out which of the European countries, and they'd have more agreements underlying that. But then there's a question of who was the perpetrator and who is the victim. So if you're an Australian on the International Space Station and you commit a murder, Australian jurisdiction would also apply. And so you could, if you found yourself in Australia, Australia may prosecute. If you happen to do it in the Russian module, you might get an extradition request from Russia. Then if the victim was, say, let's say was European, then there may also be an argument, depending on the nature of the crime and so on, that one of the country of the victim may also at least make a claim of jurisdiction. So there'd be multiple layers of arguments, and probably plenty of people in robes and wigs arguing about it for some time if it were a serious crime like that would happen. But once you get out of the International Space Station, if you were, for example, on the moon, then, or if you were outside of a space object altogether, then the jurisdiction becomes a much more complicated question. And the relevant factors, though, are going to be whose space object was it, on whose register was it registered if it happened in a space object, where were the astronauts from, which space object did they come out of, and who was the victim and where were they from. So lots of overlapping jurisdictional questions.
I see where they come from and where they were in Earth when they like first left. Now I want to ask a tailing question. So with that one, let's say like someone, let's say, lands onto the moon and decides to take a lot of moon rocks with them. Yes. Is it their property, or is it like the country's property? Like, whose property would that be?
Well, that's actually the question of who owns resources that are extracted from the moon is being discussed at the United Nations right now, and there is a working group that it's on its way to being formed, and they were going to be starting discussions at the United Nations Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in April this year, but guess what? It was postponed because of COVID. But those discussions were going to be chaired by two co-chairs. One of them is Professor Stephen Freeland from Australia, who happens to be my husband. But that's really, if you're looking at a commercial extraction of resources. If you're looking at one astronaut who happens to be there and who sticks a rock in their pocket, there are some specific permissions to take scientific samples. So it probably fits into that category of a scientific sample. Doesn't fit into a personal souvenir. That may depend on the astronaut's agreement with their own agency that took them up there, if it was a space agency. If it was a private group, which, you know, currently there's no private companies taking astronauts or tourists to the moon, that would create another interesting question altogether. The big framework question is that, or the big framework document that affects this is the Outer Space Treaty. As a base level, says no country can appropriate or claim sovereignty over the moon. So you can't put your flag in it and say we own it. And that, however, there is still a lot of debate about whether or not, if you were mining something, whether you own those resources. And if you take a whole bunch of it, does that amount to appropriation? Some people say yes, some people say no. So that's still very much up to debate. The Americans are very much saying, the Americans have passed a law saying if you extract something from the moon, you definitely own it, subject to complying with international law. So I think that begs the question a bit. It strikes me as being a bit circular. I don't know if you agree with me on that.
I guess after the discussions happen in the UN, we're probably going to get a bit more answers. Before then, Shivangi, we should probably take a walk. Yeah. And the next question I wanted to ask would be to Sakuni. It was regarding a bit about simulators, but like you're working on the helicopters at this moment. Just wanted to ask you, what do you want to accomplish next? Do you see yourself making a spacecraft simulator, or like a spacecraft simulators basically in the future?
Yep, so definitely. So I worked on, so I've been with Thales for 3 years now. So I worked in 3 different kinds of simulators and a research and development project. So my permanent project is the Tiger helicopters, but then when, you know, other projects need help and they have deadlines coming up, so we get put onto those projects. So I worked on the EC-135 is another helicopter, and the fixed wing aircraft, which is called the Wedge Tail as well. So yes, spacecraft simulators would be the dream, right? So definitely a goal would be I'm all about like gaining experiences, learning something new and challenging myself. And I think that's something that, you know, excites me to go to work every day. And people ask like, do you love what you do? And I'm like, absolutely. Like I look forward to every day that I go to work because I solve a new problem. It's not always, you know, perfect. Like you sometimes want to pull all your hair out because like it doesn't make sense. Sometimes it takes not a day, like it takes the whole week, or can take 2 weeks to solve some issues. But the outcome is very rewarding. So goals would be, yes, I was always interested in space, also interested in like satellites. So I would like to, because Thales has a global business on satellites as well. So it'll be great to have an opportunity to work on that. And yes, spacecraft simulators all the way.
That's the dream. Like once the spacecraft simulators are out, dream of being an astronaut, right there. Get into the simulator.
Yeah, I wanted to say like technical as long as I could, because I'm really enjoying the technical work, getting into the nitty-gritty of how everything works, and yeah, it's been really good.
That's amazing. Like, is there like, do you mainly work with software, or do you like do a lot of hardware, like, or are you in the middle?
So yeah, when they said the systems engineer, I was like, all right, yeah, I got this. And because I did mechatronics, like my degree wasn't heavily software based. So, and as soon as it started, I was doing a very software heavy project, as well as a lot of networking. So I didn't do a lot of networking in my uni. So I was like freaking out thinking, oh my God, what have I got myself into? But soon I got like a lot into software, not scared to, you know, go and solve a problem anymore. Learned a lot about networking. So do a lot of software at the moment, and networking as well. A little bit of hardware, a little bit of systems engineering, but these days it's been a lot of software. Yeah.
Like as a software engineering student myself, I wanted to ask you, like, you know, what are the skills that you need to become a software engineer, to make simulators? Like what kind of languages, let's say softwares, like that you kind of have to have the knowledge of?
At the moment, different simulators obviously use different kinds of software. We use C++ a lot. A lot of the scripts are written in Python to be able to launch everything. And one of the projects that I work in is kind of an older simulator. The project's been around for about 10, 15 years. That has a mix of C++, IRIX systems, Linux systems, so it's been great fun. IRIX freaked me out at the start, but I got the hang of it. It's been really interesting, and how all those things integrate into each other and we make it work. So, yeah.
Amazing. You get to go to the lowest level and kind of tinker with stuff. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So the next part of like the event, we'd like to go into the chat. Looks like the chat's getting a bit populated there, and there are a couple of great questions. So we'd like to have a look at that. So we've got a question from Callum. I see that Sakuni has answered a bit over there, but I would just like to share the question as well. So Callum has asked, are these simulation scenarios where there are issues with the aircraft? Are there any simulation scenarios that mimic them, such as engine failures, obstruction with any other objects or birds?
Yes, so there is a lot of different faults that we simulate. They have different alarms that go off, different failures. There's an instructor station, so the instructors would sit there and be like, yep, engine 1 failed, engine 2 failed. So the reaction of the pilots and environmental, like, you know, storms or like ridiculous environmental conditions, and you can put those into the scenario and build a tactical scenario and see how they react to it, and yeah, test the pilots. So yeah, it's done.
Donna, seems like you have some interesting story working with Qantas. Would you like to share that? Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, that's
well, before I worked at Optus, I worked for Qantas as a secondee for a while. So leasing aircraft and doing various things. But one of the things I had to do was a contract to purchase simulators. And I insisted that I couldn't possibly do that unless I had a go. So I went over to the jet base and they showed me how to fly a 747 into Kai Tak Airport, as it then was in Hong Kong. And what I can say is you just go straight at the checkerboard and turn right very quickly. But I was very excited. It was really fun doing that. One of those ginormous ones that's on a kind of a, like it's on a sort of an arm, and you're in this ginormous bubble, like the size of a shipping container on this massive arm. So you actually move around as you're going down, you go down. As you're going up. It bumps, and it's. I hate to think what it'd do if you crashed.
no turbulence, please.
Yeah, you do feel turbulence. You feel like you're in a real simulation. You feel like you're really flying the plane.
That's amazing. Wow. That was like, I'd love to have that experience sometime in the future.
Usually lawyers get to do fun things. Most of the time we're reading boring documents, but
got to insist to get the good part of things as well. the next question I want to direct I'd like to throw it to everyone, but I'd like to start with Antoinette for this next question. So we've got Phoebe asking, what are your predictions for future of the space industry? Are there any changes in the future of the industry that you would be particularly excited to see?
Thanks for starting that out. And, you know, there is so much change. The Australian Space Agency is 2 years old. And the reason we're right here right now is because it's a time when we've moved to what we call Space 2.0, which is moving from government driving things to the private sector driving things. And the commercialization, I mean, I think most people can watch SpaceX's activities with a bit of excitement, seeing what the private sector does a lot more efficiently and a lot more cheaply. So my feeling is that this is the most exciting time to be part of the space industry. And the next wave, I think, is going to be seeing the strength of the commercial sector. Australia's got a lot of talent. It's just that for the first time it's being coordinated and has an agency around to actually kind of, you know, drive the engagement. You know, for reference, you know, the head of the agency is Dr. Megan Clark, and she was the head of CSIRO. But even without the Australian Space Agency, she could never get a meeting with the NASA administrator because he only wanted to talk to a space agency. And now she's, you know, moved from being the head of CSIRO to the head of the Australian Space Agency, and we can have those meetings. And it now opens the doors to the private sector now to really drive the opportunities. And, you know, over the next 5 years, we've got a lot of funding to help businesses be part of going to the moon and onto Mars. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the industry take off. And there's so much for the small entrepreneurs as well as for some of the larger companies like Thales and that, who are all gearing up to respond to the enormous interest. So I think this is an exciting time. You know, the next 10 years we're driving, you know, economic development, and you can be on part of the wave to, you know, to take real advantage of it.
Very, very much of a team effort. So small knit team, very much of a team effort. That sounds amazing. Let's do this.
Yep.
The next question looks like we've got Antoinette. It's to Antoinette. So
yep.
Johnny, and so it's in regards to software engineering based roles. Are there any specific type of developers that the Australian Space Agency is looking for? Let's say in regards to the satellite based projects. And Johnny says he's assuming that it's going to be a more emphasis on data analytics or machine learning based roles, as opposed to like more traditional developing like software such as mobile or front end or like web development.
You know, the most common question I ever get asked is about jobs at the Australian Space Agency, which kind of makes my heart sing, because I remember being in high school and it was like the most unattractive, most, you know, area that nobody wanted to be involved in space, and everybody wants to be part of it. So it's wonderful. The agency is quite small. It's about 40 people, and we guide industry, we don't develop and deliver. So if you're wanting to have a technical career, my gut feeling, and you know, the financial gain is probably more in the private sector than in the government sector. The Australian Space Agency, just so that you know what we kind of do, we do civil space policy and strategies. You know, we develop strategies and then implement them. We do a lot of coordination activities. We lead international civil engagement, so this is all compared to the military side. So we do all the civilian stuff, the administration of the space activities legislation, which Donna has been talking about, inspiring the community. So we don't actually build satellites internally. What we'll do is we'll support others to do that. So if you are a software developer, what I would suggest to you is that you go out into the private sector. You make your fortunes there, and then when you have a lot of experience doing the technical side and you're wanting to do a little bit more what I call the policy side, then come to the Australian Space Agency with those skills intact. We do have a large amount of interest in jobs, and by all means follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or myself or the variety of people at the agency to see what we're doing. But go out to the industry, grab some of that experience, because once you go into a policy setting, it can be really hard to go back out into the technical field. So it's good to have like a little bit of a balance.
I might jump in to add something there, if you don't mind. In terms of what the private sector is doing, I could perhaps quickly outline what some of our clients in Australia and the region are doing. You might be aware that there is more than one launch facility being developed in Australia. There's one in South Australia called Southern Launch. There's Equatorial Launch in Northern Territory, and there's some rumblings about yet another one in Queensland. We've got Gilmore Space building rockets. We've got a couple of fleets of excellent companies doing Internet of Things using constellations of small satellites, Myriota and Fleet. And then there's also a number of other missions that are happening that are perhaps still a little bit below the radar, along the lines of, I've got one client that's developing a lunar mission. I've got one that's developing a company that will be manufacturing in space. We've got one, there's an amazing company called Fireball International that is able to detect fire in real time from geostationary orbit, which is, needs a lot of very clever artificial intelligence to be able to do that from 37,000 kilometres away, but they're able to do it, and they already have contracts in California where they're detecting a lot of fires right now. So they're actually, as far as I'm aware, they're the only country in the world that can detect fire in real time in that way from geostationary. So that's, and they're based in Noosa, interestingly. So there's a little range. There's of course Sabre, Astronautics, which is has software that is flying spacecraft. So that's a very software-based role. But there's a whole, and then Innovor, a manufacturing spacecraft. So there's a range of very interesting companies, as well as traditional ones like Optus, which has massive geostationary satellites, and NBN, which has massive geostationary satellites.
There's definitely like a lot of companies in the space industry. There's so many options in the private sector. Definitely, like even working for a big company like Thales, or starting your own startup or something like that. It's definitely amazing.
It's very encouraging as well, like to know that there are these opportunities out there as well.
And I know they're looking, and they're looking for, a number of those are hiring graduates, and a number of them are hiring people who already have space experience. But there is a particular demand also for women engineers, because they all need to get a bit of balance. All of these companies work better if they have a balance of men and women as part of their staff. And so because there are, in Australia at least, fewer female graduates, there is opportunities there, particularly for women who are looking for work in engineering, simply because it's difficult sometimes for Australian companies to get that balance. I'll also throw in, out of interest, and I know some of you might have heard me tell this story before, but I've spent a fair bit of time in the UAE working with their space agency and their universities over there, and very different environment to Australia. And you might wonder, well, what's it like for the female engineers that in the UAE? The answer is, when I asked one very senior engineer at the UAE Space Agency, what's it like working as an engineer here? She said, oh, it is a bit difficult, because engineering is regarded as a woman's job in the UAE. And then she said, oh, I mean, it's not that men can't do engineering. They can. They just need to apply themselves. But it is seen very much as a woman's job in the UAE. And I think that absolutely blew me away, because it made me realise, wow, our assumptions that engineering is a male-dominated area are very culturally based, and it's actually not true when you go into other places. So keep that in mind. And, you know, if you happen to be a man in engineering, don't give up. If you apply yourself, you too can be an engineer.
The rest of the world needs to get a bit of that, a piece of that, to diversify everything.
Sakuni, how do you find the gender balance at where you work at PAAS?
We're actually really good in terms of the balance that we have. Not 50-50, but I could say that we do have quite a lot of female engineers working with us, and quite senior roles as well. My direct line manager, she's an engineer. We have a bid and project manager who is also a senior engineer. Several other female graduates. I think there's more graduates coming in now, and not a lot of senior women engineers, but I would say it's getting better. And I've done some work with UTS with their STEM outreach programs, and you know, we are getting there. We're not there yet, but we're doing things to get us there. Yeah, so it's getting better.
I would also like to throw in just an interesting statistic. At UAE University, which is where I was speaking at a conference a little while ago, 60% of engineering graduates are women, 60. And a little while later I was, gosh, what was the country? There was another Middle Eastern country I was sitting next to. So it was Kuwait. I was talking to a professor from Kuwait University, and I said, oh, by the way, what percentage of your graduates are women? Engineering, 65%.
Wow.
So it just shows there's nothing innate about women or men that makes them good engineers. It's often culturally driven.
Wow. I guess they need help getting men into engineering.
They do. No, they do. They have affirmative action programs in the UAE to get men to do engineering.
Wow. There should be an exchange of information over here.
Yeah, exactly. It's a girly job.
That's a really interesting thing to know. And then also, like, it's a bit of encouraging as well. So, like, to everyone who's trying to encourage like women in engineering, like, it's possible. So that's really like amazing.
Yeah.
And we've got another question here to Sakuni from Johnny. So it's in regards to like the initial software heavy projects at PAAS. Did you ever experience any form of imposter syndrome?
Yes, I love this question because I did. And we recently had this conversation because I did an imposter syndrome like masterclass to like navigate through how to work through it. And at the time I was really, you know, straight out of uni, and I was put in the deep end. And then they told me after 3 months that I have to do this presentation about what I researched. And I'm going, what? These people, engineers who have, you know, 15 years, 25 years experience on top of me. And here I'm going to talk to them about something that I've done research for 3 months. And I was terrified. I just did not think that I could get there. I was like, am I good enough for this? Am I going to get through this? Am I going to be asked difficult questions? Am I going to get stuck somewhere? I've come a long way since, but at the time it was really difficult, and I got through the presentation. It was fine. I did it. But then I realized a few weeks after, like, people start coming to me about that topic, you know, or how do we get this to work? How do we get that to work? And what got me past that I actually was capable was one of the very technically capable engineers from TALIS. He knows everything. Like, he is the go-to person for everything. And he came up to me and he's like, you know, tell me about this. Have you done any documentation? Because you are now the subject matter expert on this. And I'm like, whoa, okay, yeah, I guess I am. So it was really good to hear. And we always tend to doubt ourselves, thinking, you know, can we do this? Are we able to meet the standard that, everyone's sort of expecting from us. And sometimes it's, you bottle it up, you don't want to talk to someone. And what I learned in the past few years and through a few workshops that I've been to, and I was having a chat with a colleague, and like we worked through those experiences together, and she's like, you do this, this, and this, like don't ever underestimate yourself. It's sometimes help to have a chat with someone openly about how you feel, because they see a different side to what you see, because you're always like, oh, that's not good enough, and you're being your harshest critique, I guess. And it's good to hear from someone else that, no, you're actually doing all right. And I said the same thing to her. I'm like, you've done this and this and this, like all these accomplishments, but we don't give ourselves enough credit, I guess. So yes, I definitely suffered from imposter syndrome. Sometimes I guess I still do, but it's all about better managing it and knowing how to get through it.
It's about like sticking together.
Yeah.
Such nice stick together. Us women got to stick together as well.
Yeah.
Oh, I wanted to ask, like, I know you did mention that you have definitely gone a lot better, but I want to ask you, like, what difference do you find between your initial thought process on the matter? Like, let's say when you were faced with that problem initially, what was your thought process? And if you were given a similar task right now, what is going to be your thought process?
So I guess, especially being fresh into the industry, not having that confidence, not having when you start somewhere new, you don't know if you're going to get that support. Like Colours has been great in terms of, from the time I got there, I felt like I could approach people. I could ask the question. I could ask those stupid questions, like, because you think, oh, am I going to look like an idiot asking this? But people make you feel like, no, it's like a learning experience. So when I first started, I guess I was scared to ask. I didn't know how it was going to be, the environment. I was still sussing it out. But now if I was given the task, I would be like, yep, I don't know much about this, but I am going to get through it. I'll put the hard work if needed be. I will do the extra studying, the background knowledge if I have to. But I have the confidence in myself to know that I might not know it now, but given time, like I will get there in the end. And there's people that I can reach out to. There's people I can ask questions from, and knowing that you've got that support, and not being afraid to ask the question. And yeah, the confidence, I think. It's hard when you're a fresh graduate and you have so many doubts in your head, but I guess I would say, you got through uni, you did all these projects, you have some sort of experience, you do have, problem solving skills, the basic software skills, or, all these skills that you gain at uni. It might be different when you actually are in industry and how you apply it, but you have the basic knowledge. So trust yourself and be confident that it might be hard, but you are going to get there in the end.
That's very encouraging. That's amazing. Like, that's a far way that you've come as well. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that with us. It'll be really helpful, and hopefully that helped everyone else as well on what potentially we could do next. And so in regards to that, what I want to ask you would be, I want to take this opportunity to get to the next question. So this question is from Callum, Donna, and Sakuni. So are there any legal requirements for aircraft simulators? Would it be any different for spacecraft simulators?
Sakuni went straight on mute. Good on you.
Well, legal, so I'm going to let you answer first.
Well, I've tipped myself in it, haven't I? Because I've said that I used to buy aircraft simulators, and now I don't actually recall from the time when I was doing that, the requirements for the simulator itself would have all been in an attachment that somebody else would have done. But with that said, I can speculate. So I'm not an expert on standards, for example, for aircraft simulators. But I imagine that if you want your aircraft simulator to be more than just a game, a fun thing for people to have a go at, and if you wanted to actually qualify for pilot training, I imagine the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, CASA, would have standards and rules that you'd have to comply with in order for it to qualify as, you know, I've done 10 hours on this, therefore that's 10 hours of pilot training. So I would imagine that there would be, but I haven't actually, I can't list them for you, I'm sorry. On the spacecraft side, I'm not aware of any requirements for simulators, for spacecraft simulators, but if you are planning to launch, the launch company is going to be providing its technical requirements for your spacecraft, and they may include ability to maintain certain levels of, withstand certain levels of vibration and temperature and radiation and so on. And so effectively that becomes a legal requirement, because contractually you're going to need to certify that you comply with those things under the contract.
I guess I'll add to that. Like, I don't know the legal requirements as per se, but there are a lot of requirements that go into a simulator, from simple things like, you know, how do you safely get into a simulator because it's on a platform? Do you use a drawbridge? Do you have stairs that extend so you can get up there safely? The OH&S requirements. You need to, as Donna said, to be able to certify it as, so you can get your simulator hours certified as your real flying hours. To be able to do that, you need to meet a specific, you have to fly it in a class D or B simulator, which replicates the aircraft 1-to-1. Is when you can actually get your book signed off as you've done the hours. So the simulators need to comply to all those requirements to be able to give that opportunity for the pilots to be able to say, yep, I've flown 3 hours, which gives me 3 hours on my books.
See, Sakuni, that was a great example of you experiencing imposter syndrome, because you turned your thing on mute and said, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know. But in fact, you did know.
Yeah, I think so.
But now we've got all this information. That's amazing. So we've got
sounds like similar to getting your learners, you know.
Yeah,
you know, you jot your hours down. Doing that to get your P's.
Yep. It's next step for. I'm still on my learners, so that's next step for me.
I have a question for Anntonette, for Annie. As a UTS, you know, alumnus, what do you kind of would like to see the university accomplish? Is it something? Did you ever think of maybe starting a space like society, like Gavin for us had, and now that we've been running it for about 3 or 4 years? Is that something you're very proud to see the university accomplish?
You know what, I love seeing students coming together to actually make directions and do things. You've got to remember that the university sector, I think, is the sector with the most imagination and capability to actually do some pretty cool things. I remember not having a UTS organisation to join, so I kind of joined as a groupie with the BlueSat team out at UNSW, who are working really hard on developing a satellite, and then, you know, joining onto other groups like AIAA, and I was heavily involved with Engineers Australia, and they have various committees, of which one was space related. So I didn't have probably the drive to do my own student group, but I'm so glad to see one is there. So you'll have me cheering in the background by any means, and it's wonderful. I would say my hot tip for anybody that is a student is to actually be involved in groups like this, and to participate and to actively network. When I do have the chance to look at resumes that come past the Australian Space Agency, particularly for some of our younger graduate members, I will look to see those kind of activities, because it means that you know how to run meetings, how to coordinate activities, how to feel responsible about getting things achieved, be able to show that you can meet timeframes, deliver things successfully in a professional setting. And I have to say that was one of my greatest opportunities. I didn't realise that I was learning. I was part of Young Engineers Australia, so that was my group, and you know, running committees and organisations and networking and finding contacts and seeing those contacts and engaging with them was I think a lifeblood to me walking out of my with my degree and walking into a very senior job in government. By the time that I graduated from uni, I took an extra year longer because I did 3 subjects a semester rather than 2 or 4, which was full time. And so I graduated, and I already had 5 years of experience by the time I graduated, and that meant that I was too senior for graduate roles, and I walked straight into a more senior capability. Imposter syndrome, though, works at every level. I would say even Donna would have moments. I most certainly do. The way I get around it is that I have contacts and colleagues, and you know what, the colleagues you make at uni are going to be those people that you go and do the sounding boards from. I remember I walked into a very senior job. If I had known how senior it was, I would never have applied for it. But I walked in, I got the job, and then realised that I was briefing, you know, at senators and had never done that before. And luckily for me, I had those networks and those contacts to go, I'm in too deep, help me out here. And you know what, it still happens even as a deputy head. You know, you don't turn up to royal commissions, you don't know how those things happen. So you use your networks to find those kind of answers. Knowing full well that often I tell myself I don't need to know all the answers, but the reality is I've got them at my fingertips, so I know how to get the answers even if I don't know the answer, which really helps when you're dealing with media, when they ask you questions that are completely left field and you just have to go with it. It started out, but yeah, at the end of the day, yes, absolutely. Groups like yours, please continue to do it, because I don't think you realise how awesome those skills are that you're learning without realising you are.
You definitely give some good real life skills. And Donna, who do you go to perhaps when you have those, you know, doubts in your head, or you know, you feel that imposter syndrome?
Oh, that's a good question. When you were talking about the imposter syndrome experience, I went straight back to one very intense experience that I had when my now husband Stephen first met me. He signed me up to speak at a global aerospace congress, and I honestly thought I am going to be exposed as a fraud any second now. I thought the whole thing. I did so much preparation, and I gave the talk, and people asked interesting questions, and it wasn't until afterwards, probably years later, did I realise, oh, I was the only person who knew about that topic. There were 300 people there. I was talking about how to buy a spacecraft, and it was only later when I thought about it, I was the only person in the room that had ever bought a spacecraft. But
matter expert, and you didn't know.
No, I didn't know. But who do I turn to? Pretty much absolutely everybody. I certainly do turn to my husband, but I turn to. I think Annie, your advice is spectacularly good, which is just to have a really good network. And the way you get those networks is, yes, being part of these groups, but also doing what Sakuni did, which is to go to those congresses as a student and just put yourself out there, just talk to everybody. Sakuni, it worked brilliantly for you. You met someone who said, yep, give me your CV, and it worked. Was that at Avalon, the Avalon? Yep, and yeah. So there are many space events now. And the great way to meet space people is to go to those and just talk to people over the coffee stands and the little cake stands. Once we get past this COVID thing, but at the moment you have to do it on Zoom. But none of you gorgeous students who signed in have put your cameras on. But see, it might have been a good thing, because in the future, Sakuni and Annie and I and we want to be able to recognise you and remember you as the person who came along.
Oh, definitely. It can be hard, but it's always good to show your face. as well. You know, it's good
If you're having a bad hair day, I understand.
On that, I'd like to add, because I do Lucy mentoring with UTS as well, and some of the mentees actually told me that they found this Zoom experience kind of good because they've been scared of approaching people in person, and Zoom makes it easier to ask the question because you're sort of in your own home, in your comfortable space. And they said this was a start to building that networking skills. So yeah, there you go.
I guess you're more confident when you're in like your own personal space, and it just works out for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're going to pass back to Emma. Thank you for all the panelists for giving all your wonderful advice and suggestions, and just even just being here. You're all subject matter experts to us, and you're all amazing.
Thank you so much.
I think we think you're both pretty amazing as well. It's pretty clear.
Thank you, we appreciate that. So we're gonna go give the microphone back to Emma.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I also just want to say a big thank you to the speakers for being here tonight. You guys have given some really great career advice, and I think it's so valuable for students to hear this right now, especially during COVID, during, you know, these weird, uncertain times. And just like you mentioned, I think, yeah, students much prefer to kind of have this kind of interaction over Zoom as well. So thank you for being here and providing that opportunity for them.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.